Guys, it's been a long while that I was not able to produce a video, but now it's good to be back again. So to kickstart with this video, let's discuss testamentary succession. Well, succession in the Philippines is of three kinds. Testamentary or testate succession. This is the kind of succession when there is a last will and testament left by the testator. The other one is legal or intestate succession when there is no last will and testament. So inheritance will be decided according to what is provided by law. And third is the mix of legal and testamentary succession. So, can your father make a will disposing his entire property to his favorite child, leaving the rest of the children and the wife and the illegitimate children nothing? In the Philippines, in the testamentary succession, there is what we call legitime. The legitime is the compulsory share of the compulsory heirs. It simply means that the compulsory heirs should be given their minimum share, and that is what we call the legitime. So it is the portion of the testator's estate that cannot be disposed of because it is reserved to the compulsory heirs. So let's go back to the question. Can your father make a will disposing his entire estate to his favorite child? The answer is no. Because the other legitimate children, the surviving spouse and the illegitimate children should be given their compulsory share, which is what we call, again, legitime. So who are the compulsory heirs then? The following are the compulsory heirs. 1. Legitimate children with respect to their legitimate parents. 2. Legitimate parents with respect to their legitimate children who are not married. And 3. The surviving spouse. It's either the wife or the husband. And 4. The illegitimate children. These are the 4 compulsory heirs under the Civil Code of the Philippines. So, let's discuss the legitime of these compulsory heirs. Remember, the legitime is the compulsory share of the compulsory heirs. So, let's say all are present. There are legitimate children, there is a surviving spouse, there are legitimate parents, the father and the mother of the deceased, and there is an illegitimate child or children. So, if all of these are present, then the first rule is that the legitimate parents will be excluded with the presence of the legitimate children. It simply means that the legitimate parents will not become compulsory heirs if there are legitimate children. Let's take a look at, for example, if there are legitimate children, there are legitimate parents, there is a surviving spouse, and there is a legitimate child. The legitime of the legitimate children is equal to 1/2 of the entire estate. And then the legitime of the legitimate parents, remember, the legitimate parents are excluded with the presence of the legitimate children. So legitimate parents, legitime is 0. The legitime of the surviving spouse is equal to that of the legitime of a legitimate child. So whatever is the legitime of the legitimate child, that's the legitime of the surviving spouse. And then the legitime of the illegitimate child is equal to 1/2 of the legitime of the legitimate child. So let's have, for example, if there are 2 legitimate children, there are legitimate parents, the father and the mother of the testator. There is a surviving spouse. In this case, for example, let's have the wife as the surviving spouse. and one illegitimate child. So, what's the legitim of these compulsory heirs? So, you take note, if there are two legitimate children, the legitim of the legitimate children is equal to 1/2 of the entire estate. Since there are two legitimate children, then 1/2 of the entire estate will be divided by 2. So each of the legitimate child will have 1/4 of the entire estate. The legitimate parents, as I've said, legitimate parents are excluded in the presence of the legitimate children. So legitimate parents will not be given their compulsory share. The legitim of the surviving spouse is equal to that of the legitim of the legitimate child. So, go back to the legitim of the legitimate child. It's 1/4. So, the legitim of the surviving spouse is also 1/4. If the legitim of the legitimate child is 1/4, and based on the rule that the legitim of the illegitimate child is equal to 1/2 of the legitim of the legitimate child. So since the legitim of the legitimate child is 1/4, then multiply it by 1/2. Therefore, the legitim of the illegitimate child is equal to 1/8. The remaining 1/8 is what we call the free portion. So what is this free portion? This is the only portion of the testator's estate that the testator has the freedom to choose anybody he wants. So this 1/8 can be given to his favorite child. It can be given to his surviving spouse. It can be given to his parents. It can be given to his ex-girlfriend, boyfriend, or it can be given to any random stranger. Because this is the portion that the testator has the freedom to choose anybody he wants. So what if there are 4 legitimate children that survived with the legitimate parents and the surviving spouse and 1 illegitimate child? So you need to take note that the 1/2 of the entire estate is the legitim of the legitimate children. Since there are 4 of them, you need to divide 1/2 by 4. So it simply means that each of the legitimate child will have a legitim of 1/8. Since the legitimate child's legitim is 1/8, and the surviving spouse legitim should be equal to that of the legitim of the legitimate child, then the legitim of the surviving spouse is also equal to 1/8. What's the rule again when it comes to the legitim of the illegitimate child? The law said the legitim of the illegitimate child is equal to 1/2 of the legitim of the legitimate child. In this case, the legitim of the legitimate child is 1/8. So 1/2 of 1/8 is equal to 1/16. That's the legitim of the illegitimate child. The remaining portion of the entire estate is the free portion. So if you take a look at it, there is a bigger portion of free portion that the testator has the freedom to choose anybody he wants. As I've said, he can give it to his favorite child. He can give it to his best friend or to any random stranger if he wants to, by will. So let's have another example. What if there are 2 legitimate children? There's a surviving spouse, there are parents, and what if the illegitimate children in this case are 2. So, let's go back again to the rule. 1/2 of the entire estate is the legitimate of the legitimate children. There are 2 legitimate children, so therefore each legitimate child will have 1/4. The legitimate of the surviving spouse is equal to the legitimate of the legitimate child. So in this case, the legitimate of the surviving spouse is also equal to 1/4. The legitimate of the illegitimate child is equal to 1/2 of the legitimate of the legitimate child. The legitimate of the legitimate child in this case is 1/4. So 1/2 of 1/4, each illegitimate child will have 1/8. So since there are 2 illegitimate children, both will have 1/8. And so the illegitimate children's legitimate is also equal to 1/4. Is there a free portion in this case? The answer is no. The entire estate is used for the share of the compulsory heirs. So in this case, the testator has no portion of his estate that he has the freedom to choose anybody he wants. What if there are 4 illegitimate children instead of 2? So, in this case, the scenario is there are 2 legitimate children, surviving spouse, legitimate parents, and 4 illegitimate children. So, go back to the rule. 1/2 of the entire estate will go to the legitimate children. Since there are 2 legitimate children, divide 1/2 by 2. And so therefore each will have 1/4. The legitimate of the surviving spouse is equal to the legitimate of the legitimate child. So what's the legitimate of the surviving spouse? That's also 1/4. There are 4 illegitimate children, and the remaining portion of the estate now is only 1/4. So the remaining 1/4 will be divided by 4 illegitimate children. So each of the illegitimate child will have a legitimate equal to 1/16. What if there's only 1 legitimate child and a surviving spouse and an illegitimate child? So the law said 1/2 of the entire estate will go to the legitimate child. So the legitimate of the legitimate child in this case is 1/2. Specifically, the law provides that if the surviving spouse survived with 1 legitimate child only, the legitimate of the surviving spouse is equal to 1/4. And the other 1/4 is the legitimate of the illegitimate child. If there are 2 illegitimate children in this case, then the 1/4 will be divided by 2, and each will receive 1/8. So what if there are no legitimate children? Then the legitimate parents will become compulsory heirs. So let's take a look at, for example, what if the testator was survived by his legitimate parents, his father and mother, the surviving spouse, and 1 illegitimate child? How will we determine the legitimate? Well, in this case, the legitimate parents will take the place of the legitimate children. So, the legitimate of the legitimate parents is equal to 1/2. The law specifically provides that in this case, since there are no legitimate children, the legitimate of the surviving spouse is equal to 1/8. And the legitimate of the illegitimate child is equal to 1/4. The remaining portion of 1/8 is what we call the free portion, and this is the portion that the testator has the freedom to choose anybody he wants. if there are no legitimate parents? What if the surviving heirs are only the wife and the illegitimate child or children? Then the law specifically provides that the legitimate of the surviving spouse is equal to 1/3 and the legitimate of the illegitimate child or children is equal to 1/3, and the remaining 1/3 is what we call the free portion. If any of the compulsory heirs are surviving, let's say for example that the testator is survived only by his spouse, that the testator is survived only by his legitimate parents, or the testator is survived only by his illegitimate children or child, then the law said the legitimate is equal to 1/2. If the only surviving is the surviving spouse, then the legitimate of the surviving spouse is 1/2. If the only surviving is the illegitimate child or the illegitimate children, then the legitimate of the illegitimate child or children is equal to 1/2. The remaining 1/2 is what we call the free portion. So that concludes our discussion on testamentary succession. Look for the next video for the discussion on legal or intestate succession. Bye guys!